Thank you all for having me here. I'm very honored. I feel honored to speak at this Holocaust Living History workshop at the University of California here in San Diego on this topic. Thanks for Susanne to organize this and to get me here. I also want to thank many of the administrators who did much of the work and helped me to process the application or all the stuff that needs to be done for such a trip. When I give talks like this, I always feel a bit bad because it's actually a depressing subject that I'm going to discuss with you, and I'm sorry about this. It's part of my job, to be honest, and this one is particularly depressing because it's a murder case in many ways. I try to make this, or I try to use this to understand some fundamental problems of post-war West German history. And I'm sorry if it's depressing. I will present to you a historical case of right-wing anti-Semitic violence, a murder in post-war Germany in the year 1980. I will explain the problems for the contemporaries and among them the police and as well also the journalists and media to understand this violence. And I would try to explain why this act of violence and some of the other acts in the same year were almost completely forgotten until a few years ago. Also, I myself barely remembered this history, and so the book was also sort of a constant revelation of facts to me myself when I did the research. Let me start by saying that the double murder in Erlangen was not the only case of murderous violence at the time. In fact, the year 1980 was the deadliest year of political violence in post-war German history, and one of the worst in history overall if we ignore the Nazi period for a moment. 18 people were murdered in this year, and in addition, 2 of the assassins died as well. The most fatal attack you see in the image below took place in Munich. It targeted the famous Oktoberfest, and it killed indiscriminately 13 visitors to this festival and wounded over 220, many of them severely. Even much less well known is the arson attack that you see on the top in a street in Hamburg. This was an arson attack against a home of Vietnamese refugees, killing 2 of them at that night. And this was maybe the first, we're not yet sure, we're doing more research on this, if not possibly the first racist terrorist attack killing refugees in post-war Germany. So all of these victims were killed by right-wing terrorists with often quite substantial organizational structures enabling them to do so. And this was not just a German development, and often other European events in the same year are completely forgotten as well. The train station attack in Bologna, one of the worst cases of terrorist violence in Europe, killing 85 victims in the same year. Or the attack against the Paris synagogue with 4 victims also in the same year. While we know that the first attack, or we're pretty sure that the first attack was also committed by right-wing activists and right-wing terrorists, we're not quite sure about the second. The second remains a mystery in many ways. So the attack on the synagogue in Paris. In the end, when you look at this, and you have to add the story that I will talk about just now, when you look at this, there is a quite simple question. emerging. How and why was this violent history forgotten in post-war Germany? We could ask the same question about Italy, but I won't do this tonight. In many ways, the double murder that I will talk about gives us some indications why that happened, but it also is a special case because it's also a case, and probably the first one as far as we know, of an anti-Semitic murder. And because it involved a Jewish victim. So I will start by explaining what happened that night. It happened in Erlangen, south of Germany, the northern parts of Bavaria, Franconia actually. On September 19th, Shlomo Lewin and Frida Poeschke were shot dead in their houses in Erlangen. It was a Friday evening, the Shabbat had just begun. The former chairman of the Jewish community in Nuremberg, Lewin, opened the door unprotected, also because it was quite customary for the two to receive visitors from the community in their house. It was an open house, so to speak, for interactions and communication between Jews and non-Jews or Christians. The perpetrator shot them both, immediately disappeared, again without stealing anything or leaving a letter claiming responsibility. This is important because the police expected such a thing for political violence. I will explain in a moment. What he did leave behind was this these sunglasses. Several months later, these glasses provided the clue that the crime had been committed by Uwe Behrendt, a leading member of the Wehrsportgruppe Hoffmann, a West German right-wing militia group. I will talk about them in a moment. So, however, the problem for the investigators initially, when they arrived at the spot and in the days afterwards, was that this is a difficult case. There was no apparent motivation on the site. It wasn't a robbery because nothing had been taken away. From the perspective of the time, the police believed that this could also not have been a political murder because the note of confession that I mentioned was missing. So there was no declaration of responsibility, and there seemed no ideological reason for this event. In addition, the investigators found some traces at the crime scene, especially some footprints in the snow, which they believed to have come from a woman's shoe, which later on they didn't see that way anymore for reasons that I could never find out. But they believed at the time initially that a woman must have been involved in this murder. And they believed as well that this would speak against an offense with a right-wing extremist background, because in their eyes, women were supposedly playing no role in right-wing circles. This was actually not true in general, and it's not true today as well. And it wasn't true at the time, and it wasn't true in the group that was later on found out to be responsible for this, the Hoffman group. There were women in this, and the police could have known this, or actually they did know because they had publications with photos of women in the group. However, the investigators concluded that some private motivation had caused the double murder. Some family affair with a female perpetrator, for example, a former wife of Lewin. So they opted for this direction, and the investigation was led to understand the private life of the couple. Of course, this assumption made a lot of sense. As we all know, if you watch crime stories, most of the murders in the end turn out to be committed by people from the private surroundings of one of the victims. And the police knows this and has to act accordingly. So it's true also in this case that they needed to consider this. On the other hand, though, this case involved a Jewish victim. A political motive was therefore obviously possible. In fact, the investigators included an act of political violence by right-wing extremists or Palestinians, Palestinian terrorists, remember the 1970s, in their list of possible motives. But when you look at how they actually investigated the case, they were much more interested in the private story. So they were putting much resources into investigating the personal surroundings of the victims. And this also revealed a certain bias, which I think is interesting. They searched for the perpetrator primarily in Levin's surrounding and much less in the environment of Frida Poeschke, the other Protestant victim. Thus, they tended to believe that the offense had something to do with the Jewish victim. At the same time, people were unable to imagine an anti-Semitic motive for the offense. Antisemitism, as I will explain later on a little bit more, was no longer supposed to exist in post-war German society. This was the official attitude of the state and the government in light of what had happened during the Holocaust. But let me say a few words about the two victims. First of all, because I think it's important to remember them, and that's an aim in itself. But second, also, it is crucial to explain their lives because the perpetrators actually knew them. Not personally, but they knew who they were, or they knew who Lewin was. Here you see one of the few private photos that I could find of the two, probably a few years before the murder. Frida Poeschke was a Protestant, born in 1923, and she was the widow of the former mayor of Erlangen, Michael Poeschke, a social democrat who the Nazis had imprisoned in the Dachau concentration camp in 1933, and who then got the post after the war as an opponent to Nazism and became the mayor of Erlangen. After her husband, and he died already in 1959, and then Frida Poeschke, the widow, withdrew from public eye in many ways. A few years later, she met, though, Shlomo Lewin at an event organized by the Franconian Society for Christian-Jewish Reconciliation. These were groups all over Germany that were very important for starting a reconciliation between Jews and Christians. And also there was a very active chapter in Franconia, and Shlomo Lewin was very, very much involved. Frida Poeschke thus began to work for Lewin's publishing house Ner Tamid, which is Hebrew, and the name translates into eternal light. This was one of the few publishing houses that published books on Jewish history and on anti-Semitism in the 1980s, 70s and 60s. The two cultivated a special kind of hospitality in their home. In 1980, as a contemporary said afterwards, a bridge between Christians and Jews was built there, which was still very rare at the time. Frida Poeschke was only 57 years old when she was murdered. Shlomo Lewin, on the other hand, was born in Jerusalem in 1911. And he came from a very old Jerusalem family, a sort of family dynasty that had lived in the city for many decades, possibly even generations. And his father had accepted, reasons that I don't know, in 1917, so in the middle of the First World War, a post as a rabbi in Poznan, in what is today Poland, but used to be Germany during this time. So Lewin actually grew up in Germany. In 1935, he had to flee from the National Socialists, who had briefly took him into protective custody, as they called it. He eventually ended up in Palestine, and he took part in the Second World War in the British Army, and then transferred to the Israeli army and took part also in the War of Independence. Interestingly, he chose to return to Germany in the 1950s. It's a bit unusual, but then again, it's not that unusual. In the 1950s, around almost 6,000 Jews from Israel returned to Germany for various reasons, some of them to the East Germany, some of them, many, I think a majority, to West Germany. And he then started to set up a publishing house there. From 1977 to 1979, and this is very important for my talk, he was the chairman of the Jewish community in Nuremberg. And when he was killed, a few days later, he was scheduled to open a community also in Erlangen, which due to his death did not take place until 1995. Lewin was therefore a well-known man in the Franconian region. He was known to politicians, he was known to the public. He was also particularly active, as I said, in the Society for Christian-Jewish Cooperations or Reconciliation, and increasingly became an admonisher against right-wing extremist tendencies at the end of the 1970s. He specifically focused quite often on the Wehrsportgruppe. I'll explain in a moment what that was, who later on killed him, or from whom the killer came. This became very clear in now I get to a very strange, I think it's a somewhat strange source, an Italian article in an Italian magazine called Oggi. Oggi is sort of was a popular magazine with somewhat political as well, with a lot of images, and you can tell by the image itself. What they had commissioned, this journal, they had sent, because there was a lot of right-wing activities also in Italy, they had sent a journalist, Luigi Bernardi, to Germany to find out about the right-wing activities there. And he met virtually all the important heads of the right-wing movement, of the neo-Nazi groups partly, and talked to them. So among others, he also talked to Hoffman, and this is the guy with the large cat, which is actually a puma, and he really had one, which scared the journalists a lot when they tried to interview him. I think the journalist Bernardi had interviewed this row of neo-Nazis, and he felt the need to have one voice of possible victims of this. So he met also Shlomo Lewin, and you see him in the smaller picture on the left at the bottom in the room of the Nuremberg congregation of the Nuremberg small synagogue, which was not actually a synagogue, it was more a praying room. So, this article placed Lewin and his later, the head of the Wehrsportgruppe next to each other. And in this text, or in this article, in the interview, Lewin even referred directly to Hoffman and the Hoffman group, and he warned about him. So he said, you shouldn't underestimate people like Hoffman. In the beginning, Hitler also seemed to be a man without success. This is not the only event. There was another event which in the end did not take place, but was important and interesting in itself. That in 1977 in Nuremberg, there was supposed to be what was called an Auschwitz Congress. It was actually a meeting of world famous Holocaust deniers. Among them, some of you may know Arthur Butz, an engineer professor from Northwestern, who famously wrote the book The Hoax of the 20th Century, referring to the Holocaust. And he was very internationally in these circles widely known, so he was invited to this Congress in 1977. This did not take place in the end because the local authorities in Nuremberg forbade this Congress. But there were nevertheless already in the development before the days, or before the Congress was supposed to take place, there were rallies against this. And on one of these rallies, Shlomo Lewin, you see him here in the middle or on the left, protested publicly on the square in Nuremberg against this Congress, which was partly also organized by Hoffman. So it's very likely, I think it's almost, we can be sure, that Hoffman realized that Lewin protested against him and the event. I would also like to point out to you that Hoffman actually had a copy of the Oggi article. The police knew this as well, because the police found this copy lying on his bed when they searched his house. So the connection between Lewin and Hoffman was not only known to the Hoffman group, but was also known to the police, or it was known that the Hoffman group knew this. So it made perfect sense, I think, to assume that Lewin could be a target or could become a target by Hoffman and the Wehrsportgruppe as a Jewish opponent. Let me now describe the perpetrators a little bit. First, a few words about the Wehrsportgruppe, about this military group, and then about the right-wing extremism at the time. So this is the Wehrsportgruppe. You see Hoffman on the bottom. The Wehrsportgruppe was founded in 1973 by this man as a military training group, and the image actually is also from the Oggi, which is the reason why Hoffman actually had a copy, because he was very proud of this, and he used to present this article to followers and people who were interested, because it made him look like he really had he was organizing a military group, right? He was doing real military activities. This group developed into a rallying point for right-wing extremist youth in the 1970s. We estimate that about 400 to 600 members joined eventually. It was somewhat of a loose structure. You could take part in some of these training sessions and then leave again. This is also the connection to several acts of violence in the year that I reported earlier. The the assassin of the Oktoberfest, the attack against the Oktoberfest, Gundolf Köhler, had taken part in 2 or 3 of these military training sessions and was in private contact with Hoffman. For all of these reasons, because it was a military group and they were increasingly threatening, before all of these attacks, though, in January 1980, the group was forbidden by the Federal Ministry of the Interior, Gerhard Baum. So the German government basically forbade the group. The remnants of the group did not stop to be active. Actually, they left Germany and joined the PLO, the Fatah, in Lebanon. So they actually got into a training camp next to Beirut and acted there. This is important for the murder because it made the murder case even more difficult to solve, because the murderer himself and the whole group were not present in Germany. They actually were in Beirut. And this is, in the end, the guy who killed the two, Uwe Behrendt, and you see that he died in 1981. He actually killed himself, shot himself, as far as we know, in Beirut when the group dissolved. One of the things that I try to do, I think for the first time in my book, is not to just discuss this group as a right-wing radical group, but to focus on their anti-Semitism. So, of course, this is a group which is very hostile to the democracy. It is authoritarian. There is a military cult there. You could describe them maybe not as Nazis, but as fascists. And Hoffman himself always wanted to make this distinction. He saw himself more as a fascist and not as a Nazi, if there is any distinction like this, but in his eyes there was. The kind of anti-Semitism that you find here is twofold, I would say, and that made it maybe a bit difficult for the contemporaries to understand. The contemporaries, in many ways, the police as well, and also the investigators, and later on also the judges, understood anti-Semitism very much as a Nazi ideology. And that's still a problem in many cases, I think. But this is a group that actually focused their anti-Semitism to some degree on two other subjects. First of all, the denial of the Holocaust. I already mentioned that Hoffman was involved in organizing the Congress. He was actually in contact with many Holocaust deniers, and he wrote in his own publication against the memory of the Holocaust, which was very important in 1979. I don't know if you remember, some of you may have seen the movie or the series Holocaust, a story about a family which came out, I think, in 1978 in the United States, but then was shown on German TV and caused a huge amount of interest in Germany, and really a wave of recognition, and millions of people watched the series on TV. So this was hated by the right-wing radicals, and Hoffman actually published against this and made fun of it and made jokes about this. Anti-Semitism was also commonplace in the communication within the group. So if they were amongst themselves, they often made jokes about Jews. At the same time also, when the remaining group in Beirut found out that Levin had been killed, they celebrated. The other element of their anti-Semitism was directed against Israel. That was one of the reasons why they were in Beirut, because they wanted to fight against Israel. And there's a lot of evidence also of a conspiracy thinking that they believed that the ban and also some of the persecution by the police was actually caused by the Israeli Mossad. And so, there's a conspiracy thinking in this group going on. Despite such findings, some of which were already known to the police at the time, it did not occur to them to look for a connection initially between Hoffman and this group and Levin. It becomes very clear, and this is the story of the glasses. Actually, police spent weeks searching for each. There was on the glass, the manufacturer was mentioned, and so they could find out how many of these had been sold. And unfortunately, they had been sold around the world. I think about 50. So the police tried to get hold of each copy of this, or each version of this glasses. And they spent weeks and weeks, but they didn't ask a very obvious question. The address of the manufacturer was next door to where the Hoffman group had resided for a long time. And I'm still struck by the fact that they didn't make that connection. Actually, the story in the end was that the senior chef of the senior head of this company went to the police and remembered suddenly that he had given the glasses to the Hoffman group next door. And then the police finally found out that this had been caused by the Hoffman group or by one member who had used these glasses as a disguise. You could say, okay, so they failed to find this evidence, or they didn't make the connections. And it's not my job necessarily to really correct the police or anything. I'm asking questions about how and why was this possible? Why was it possible that anti-Semitism was not so present on their mind when they investigated the crime? And I think there are two kinds of difficulties that the investigators faced, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them. The predominance of left-wing terrorism that was on the minds of investigators, and thus made them not see the right-wing terrorism. The other one is the problem of understanding anti-Semitism as a post-war ideology and a possible motivation for the murder. So let me start with the first one. I brought you statistics. So since, and this is an official statistic from the security forces in Germany. So these are the right-wing incidents and violent offenses. The red line is the violent offenses. Sorry for the missing German translation. The English translation from German. So the red line is the violent offenses. These are really physical attacks. The blue line is general attacks. This could be also slogans. This could also be demonstrations, etc. But you could see that around about 1977 or 1976, 1977, the numbers go up. And this was recognized by the police. I'm not saying that they were ignorant. They saw this, but they didn't interpret it correctly. There was a creeping radicalization that had not been properly recognized, I think, by the authorities. In my book, I've collected lists of weapons that the police in this period between 1977 and 1980 found, and the list is really impressive. So I'm just going to go through a few things. 35 machine guns, 370 rifles, 14 small caliber rifles, more than 1,000 other weapons, 6 knives, a lot of ammunition, a bazooka, grenade launcher, over 16 kilos of explosive. So, and the list goes on. So the police, this is just what they found, right? So the police had clear indicator of a mobilization, a radicalization, and a potential violent turn on the right. And they noticed this. This is from official documents, so it's not my invention or anything. This was known to them. So when the 1980 became the terrorist year in German history, in West German history, it did not happen out of the blue. But we encounter here a fundamental problem. Right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism were not taken serious, especially in comparison to left-wing terrorism of the Red Army fraction. And this is due to another development in German history at the time, what the German call the German Autumn, the Deutsche Herbst in the year 1977. This was the high time of left-wing terrorists, and Hans-Martin Schleyer, who was a leading entrepreneur in Germany, was kidnapped and then killed in September 1977. And also in October, the airplane Landshut was hijacked by the Red Army fraction and Palestinian terrorists. And you see, after they had been captured, successfully captured, you see the hostages being freed. In comparison, and this is very much on the minds of the security forces, of the police, etc. In comparison to this, many Germans, and I could include, for example, my parents, who felt personally threatened by these developments. I remember this as a young boy, and they admitted it later as well. Although they lived in the north of Germany and there was no danger whatsoever, but they felt personally threatened by this kind of left-wing terrorism. In comparison to this, right-wing violence seemed less important and not really to be taken serious. I think you could make an argument now, and this has been very prominent in the literature. You could make an argument now that we have in the security forces and in the police and the leadership of the police, maybe in even some higher ups in the politics, we still have people connected to Nazism. Yes, true. So maybe to some degree at least. So maybe they did not look to the right because, that's their heritage, right? So they downplayed it, ignored it for political reasons. And there could be we could make an argument, especially about Bavaria. Remember, Erlangen is in Bavaria, and Bavaria was a very right-wing state, and I do see a case in point there. On the other hand, though, I'm interested in the fact that this goes well beyond the parties. This goes well beyond the right. Many groups, also in other political camps, among them social democrats, had the same kind of focus on left-wing terrorism and ignored right-wing terrorism. So why is this? I think it is for various reasons, but there are structural reasons, structural elements of misunderstanding. I think the concept of right-wing terrorism is basically fundamentally different at the time. Right-wing terrorist works differently than left-wing terrorists. And this was not understood. I give you one other indicator of this. This is from a document by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the highest office of security force in Germany. And that's what they published about right-wing extremists in 1979. So right before the wave of violence from these groups. Right-wing extremists do not have an ideology in the sense of a coherent structure of thought or argumentation. In its place is a conglomeration of heterogeneous splinters of ideas that are usually combined at random and on closer inspection lack any intellectual penetration and argumentative underpinning. They regularly exhaust themselves in a series of emotionalized, superficial theses, slogans, and political slogans with racist, anti-Semitic, nationalist, xenophobic, Germanophile, and ethnic collectivist and anti-party and totalitarian objectives. If you just take the adjectives from the final sentence and you link it to the first sentence, it's very interesting. There's a lot of ideology here. It's like racism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, xenophobia. You can go on. And it still says there is no ideology. And in the middle part, it basically says, and I'm often putting this a bit provocative, these right-wing groups are a bit stupid. It says in the middle, they lack any intellectual penetration and argumentative underpinning. I would translate this as they're a bit dumb. That is interesting. The person who actually committed the murder in 1980 had studied at a university. He was not dumb at all. He was actually highly intelligent. But here we have a notion that is still existing in Germany to some degree, that these right-wing neo-Nazis are, they go to a pub, get drunk, and then they beat up somebody. And that's their kind of loose terrorism. That's not to be taken serious. I think that's flawed. And I think they actually are serious political actors. Also, there is a different structure to right-wing terrorism. As I told you, there was no letter of confession found at the spot of the murder. That's because right-wing terrorists, as one colleague of mine had phrased it, don't communicate. They're not interested in communicating their motives to the public. This has changed recently, but never mind. Historically, in the 1980s, they were not interested in communicating their ideology. They had a different structure of communication. They were still communicating. How did they communicate? They communicated through the act. That sounds a bit weird, right? But you could describe right-wing terrorist acts as signaling acts. Ideology was not their point. Their point was to communicate through violence. And the message through violence, they call it often deeds, not words, is a slogan. Taten statt Worte in German is a slogan that you find in right-wing circles quite often. And part of it is because they select different victims. The left-wing terrorists looked at the heads of state. Remember the famous entrepreneur that I just showed you, Hans-Martin Schleyer? He was actually the head of the organization of the German entrepreneurs. So they target, left-wing radicals target the elites, the political elites of the state in order to destabilize the state. Right-wing terrorists don't do that usually. They target they target individuals from the society. There are a few exceptions, I admit, and maybe because they're in your mind, I will point them out to you. There are two cases of famous, by now infamous, of course, cases of murder in West Germany or in German history, where right-wing terrorists actually attacked politicians. And on the left, you see the assassination of Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister of Germany in 1922, who was assassinated by right-wing terrorists of a neo-Nazi, at the time, Nazi group. Or on the right, a case that you might not be familiar with, but a very recent case, the killing of Walter Lübcke, who was a social democrat in Kassel, and he has been killed in 2019 by a right-wing radical or right-wing terrorist because he had supported the refugee policy and the taking in of refugees into Germany. So yes, it does happen at times, but structurally I would argue that right-wing terrorists usually target individuals from certain groups in society. They want, today it's often immigrants or refugees, and both of these individuals were targets also because they were representatives of a certain politics. Walter Rathenau because he was Jewish, Walter Lübcke because he was in favor of the admission and the integration of foreigners and refugees. So the difference is that right-wing terrorists identify and attack the society and not the state. So from a certain perspective, they are less dangerous for the state because they don't threaten the heads of state, but they threaten parts of the society. So that makes us understand a bit better what the signaling act actually is. What do they want to achieve? How do they communicate through violence? I think there are three elements of signals that right-wing terrorists actually use. One is some groups within society need to be erased from society. And we start to do this by killing some of them. So in this case, Jews and refugees. There's also more specific signals that are sent. There is a signal to other right-wing radicals. We could say that, we do this, and we can successfully do it, and please follow us and do the same. And the third, and maybe most important element of this, is a specific signal to the victims. We can target you and we can hit you wherever you are. I think these are elements that are important in the signaling communication form of right-wing terrorists. Okay, let me move to the other explanation, the more specific explanation for the double murder, or why the double murder was so difficult to investigate. One of the biggest problems in the investigation was the fact that they could not imagine an anti-Semitic motivation for this. How? Well, because anti-Semitism was not supposed to exist. It is the founding ideology of the German state, in some call it Staatsräson, raison d'être of the German state, that anti-Semitism should not exist. And this goes back, way back to the founding of the state. Actually goes back to an American founder of the state, John McCloy, who was the High Commissioner of the Allies in Germany, and he actually said that the German state should protect Jews, and this would be a sign of their success. of the success of the state. And thus, the first German president, Theodor Heuss, actually said, actually, interestingly, to a foreign news agency, he already said in 1949, right after the state had been founded, and I quote, "German democracy will have to suffer less from anti-Semitism and other manifestations of the Hitler era than many other countries. There is no longer any real anti-Semitism in Germany." He said that in 1949, 4 years after the end of the Holocaust and after the Nazi period. And he knew very well that this was wrong, right? He knew that, of course, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Some even claim that there was more anti-Semitism after 1945 than before in the population. But they said it because they wanted it to not be there, right? They repeated it, especially to foreign audience, that anti-Semitism does not exist. And at the same time, of course, they integrated the former Nazi perpetrators into the offices and into the economic structure. Okay, so in many ways, the anti-Semitism was not supposed to be there. So to understand that in 1980, another anti-Semitic murder had been committed in Germany was something that nobody really wanted to admit, and that's why it's absent. When you go through some of the sources, you will not find any mentioning of an anti-Semitic motive for this, when it's obvious from the end result and obvious from the sources of the Wehrsportgruppe that this was caused by anti-Semitism. Let me move on and give you a few more details about how Germany actually dealt with the events. And I think it's important for that to understand how the events were framed initially. If you look at the press coverage, you find a very depressing picture. Only a few remembered the 2 dead persons in a positive way, and this is, the German original. It's a family friends who remember and who place this obituary in a local newspaper, who remember the evenings that they had with with the 2 victims, and they praise the victims as intelligent, generous, and tolerant people with whom they experienced true humanity and mutual understanding and comfort. And the word in German is Geborgenheit, which is a very, very positive term. But this was unusual and not the case at all. The rest, the basic trend of the news coverage of these events was quite clear. All kinds of rumors about Lewin appeared within hours after the event happened. Allegedly, Orthodox Jews had resented Lewin's relationship with the non-Jewish woman Poeschke, was one version. There had been conflicts in the Nuremberg leadership, and that's true, but that was not enough for a motive for murder, I would say. But they believed, of course, the Jews kill each other, obviously. There was also immediate speculation that the 69-year-old Lewin was a Mossad agent. And when the Israelis explicitly denied this, this was taken as a confirmation, because what the secret Israeli service denies is always true. And they wrote this, and they meant it. In this case, of course, you can see that there are anti-Semitic stereotypes in the reception already, and there is a kind of twisting of victims and perpetrators here. The victim becomes the perpetrator, and so then the event, in many ways, quickly vanishes because it's seen as not an important event, even in the local newspapers. And I brought you a quote from the closest friend of Lewin, who actually was scheduled to go with him to open the Erlangen Jewish community a few days after the murder. And this is how he remembered this in an interview in 2011. And he said, they didn't want to take it upon themselves that after the whole Holocaust there was such a case in Germany that you shoot a Jew at night in the parlor, in the flat. They didn't want it. The newspapers wrote about it from all over the world, what happened here in Germany. They didn't want it. They always wanted to keep themselves clean. They always rejected it. They always rejected. They also rejected today the whole anti-Semitism, and it's not like that. The massive questioning of Lewin, I think, is the background to this sad insight of Josef Jakubowicz. And this is also how the Jewish community in more general terms perceived and remembered this event. And I brought you another quote from, also after the fact, from the then head of the German Jewish Council, so the highest office of German Jews and the highest representative of German Jewry, Paul Spiegel. And remembering the double murder, he said, there was sheer horror in the Jewish communities, but also horror that this was apparently not perceived by the general public as it should have been, because it was really the first time after 1945 that Jews were killed by people close to National Socialism, and we didn't understand at the time why this didn't result in an outcry from the entire population. And exactly that's the case. There was really no outcry of this. Hoffman and his partner were put on trial a few years later for the double murder. What were not found guilty. Actually, they are free. Hoffman was sentenced to a long prison sentence, but not for the double murder. Actually, the double murder case was completely forgotten from this moment onwards. Nobody really remembered it until the 2010s, when after the uncovering of the National Socialist Underground, I don't know if you're familiar with this, these three individuals formed the National Socialist Underground in 1998, I think it was, and between 2001 and 2010, they murdered 10 people, most of them of Turkish, Greek, and Kurdish descent, and they launched 3 bomb attacks, which also harmed many people. The group was detected in 2011, and only after then the German society focused more on right-wing terrorism and realized, wow, this is a problem. We have to go back into history and remember or uncover some of the stories that we didn't understand. There is a structural problem here, I think, especially for the victims. While left-wing terrorists, as I said, primarily threaten the state authorities, right-wing terrorists sought out victims from minority groups and commit signaling acts against them. And with the Spiegel quote, you can see that this indeed had an effect on the small Jewish community. They were frightened about this development, and they realized that the general civil society did not care about this. And I think in some ways the logic of the anti-Semitic terrorist right-wing acts were actually fulfilled in some ways, because they separated the general society and the Jewish victims. And in that way, one of the signaling effect somehow, in a way, worked. It also had a very complex and, I think, difficult connection to this story in 2011. And maybe it's a bit theoretical, but it's my final point. The police, the security forces, are actually, in a way, working with historical memory. When they get to a site of a political violence, they need to understand what is going on here. Is this private, or has this a political meaning? And of course, they will evaluate what they see by what they had previously understood to be possible. That's, in a way, they have a memory of possible historical cases. And since this case, and the entire terrorist activity of the 1980s was not remembered in many ways, the police, was not able to look at this. And of course, they followed all of these murders from 2001 onwards that the NSU committed, but they could not comprehend them. They thought it had been done from within the Turkish community, some form of organized crime. They didn't think about right-wing terrorists. And I gave you one last quote. The chief criminal director of the police headquarters, who was in charge of investigating these cases, is actually also in Franconia, so there's a regional continuity there, was the most important investigator for the murders of the NSU. And he admitted after the fact, so in 2011, that he could not have imagined until the end that right-wing terrorists existed on this scale. Actually, one politician said the very same thing when Walter Lübcke, the person I showed you a moment ago, in 2019 was killed. Again, they said, oh, we didn't know that we have so much right-wing terrorism. Well, my argument is yes, because you didn't study the history and you didn't understand that this is possible and that this has happened quite for a long time. So in some ways, it's a sad story for the victims because it's, in some ways it isolated them from the general society and made them into targets again. But it's also a sad story for the political system of Germany because it wasn't possible to process this terrorist activity in the year 1980 and thus was in a way bound to repeat itself of failing to find the reasons for these acts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.